Welcome to breadboarding. This is the Breadboard PC, and in this video what I'm going to be showing you, after the previous video where I showed what happens when you turn a PC power on, what I'm going to show you now is how to set up and configure an early version of MS-DOS. So I'll be looking at MS-DOS 330, which is the version we used in the Breadboard PC. So before we switch it on, I'll just show you a few of the main features of the Breadboard PC. If you haven't seen anything about this, there will be a link at the top of the screen for a summary video, and the links will also be in the description below. So we've got an Intel 8088 microprocessor down here. This is a 8-bit bus version of the 8086. So the 8086 and 8088 were software compatible, but this version was slightly simpler to build computers with because it only required an 8-bit data bus. Then we've got various buffers, clock circuits. We've got the EPROM or the ROM with the BIOS in it. We've got about half a megabyte of RAM. Some logic here to control a keypad and LED display that we use for doing some of our debugging. Over on the left here we've got a video controller, so this is a monochrome display adapter, and down the bottom here we've also got a hard disk controller, real-time clock. We've got the hard disk up there with a SATA to IDE converter, so we can actually use a modern disk in an older style computer. We've then got a floppy disk in there below it. The floppy disk is actually ejected at the moment. We've then got our PS2 keyboard and mouse controller with just the keyboard in there at the moment, and then up here is our floppy disk controller. And at the very top of the board here we've got some controller chips, so DMA controller, programmable interrupt timers, programmable interval timer, and a power on self-test port. And we've also then got a logic analyzer here connected to the power on self-test port, so we can actually see if the computer doesn't boot up properly, the last byte from that port will tell us how far it got. Now this design also uses these breadboard power rails as the address bus and the data bus. So what I'm going to do now is to power it on, and then we're going to have a look and see what DOS shows us. So I'm just going to show the video screen on the left here. Now when it comes up, you can see it comes into the Nanocomp monitor here. So this is just a simple little program that I copied over from the 6809 project I did. Convert it to run on Intel 8086. We type B twice. You can see we've got the power on self-test screen. It searches for a floppy disk in A. We'll try a few times, and then after a few seconds it will then boot off the C drive. Now when MS-DOS starts up and there are no configuration files, then it always shows you the date and time. So one of the first things we want to do is to change it so that when it boots up we don't have to press enter for the date and the time. It looks like the date and the time are pretty accurate at the moment, so we don't need to change those at the moment. So let's just make the video screen full screen. So a number of ways how you can create configuration files. There are two main configuration files in the root of any MS-DOS boot disk. That will be autoexec.bat and config.sys. Now autoexec.bat is just really what commands you want it to run at power on. Now one of the most useful commands when you're navigating around the computer is called prompt, and we can include two parameters, $p, $g. Now this is one you tend to get to know, and what this does is shows you what the drive and directory that you're currently in. So if we go down to the DOS directory, then we're now in the DOS directory. So prompt $p, $g is quite a useful one to have. So what we're going to do, it's a very simple way of creating autoexec.bat. Now one of the things that DOS allows you to do is redirect the console input and redirect output, and you can also pipe output from one program into the output of another. So for example, you can use it to sort and filter things, for example, much like you can on Unix. What we're going to do is in fact copy the console to autoexec.bat, and what all we're going to do in here is prompt $p, $g, new line, and then we'll do Control Z, which is the end of file. Okay, so now if we do a directory listing, you can now see we have an autoexec.bat file, and if we type autoexec.bat, you can see it's now $p, $g. So I'm going to do now is to reboot this and see whether or not we get the prompt for the date and time. Okay, so we get prompt.p.g, and now if we change folder, change directory, we also get the prompt. Okay, so we've created a basic autoexec.bat file, and the only issue here is that it's still showing the command. So what we can do is to edit this. If we add the echo command, we can turn the echoing of commands off from batch files when they're being run. So this would hide the prompt and anything else that we add in here. But there's also a problem that when I press Shift 2 on my keyboard, I have a UK keyboard, so double quotes on Shift 2. Then when I do Shift 2, I get the @ symbol, and when I do the @ symbol, I get double quotes, and when I do the hash symbol, I get slash. So the keyboard mapping is not quite right, and it's possible to change that using the keyboard command. And the Internationalisation in MS-DOS 330 was overhauled, and there's now a keyboard command with UK. We have to specify the code page, so 437 is default code page, and then we also need to tell DOS where the keyboard.sys is. So I need to put it in the DOS folder there. So once that's loaded, now if I do Shift 2, I get quotes. When I do the @ symbol, I get @. When I do various slash characters, then I get the right characters. So that makes it work. Interestingly, there is actually a shortcut. If you do Control-Alt F1, it'll go back to the default American way. So when I do 2, and when I do the @ symbol, and then if I do Control-Alt F2, then it goes back to the default way. So we need to add that command into the autoexec.bat. Now, I did try using Edlin a couple of times, and it ended up damaging the disk and corrupting the root directory. So what I'm going to do is to try and use the Norton utilities that I think I showed in some of the earlier videos. So Norton Editor is here. So we're just going to go into Norton Editor. So go into Norton Editor, and we're going to open the autoexec.bat file. So we just select autoexec.bat. Okay, so now we're going to put echo off. So the only problem with echo is that it turns off the echoing of commands, but it comes up itself. So if you put an @ symbol in front of it, then it won't. And we're also going to now do the C/DOS keyboard UK 437, and we need to give it the full path to keyboard.sys. And I think what we'll also do, we can use the path statement. So don't think path needs to have the prefix. So we can do path, it's an internal command, so we don't need to include the prefix. So what we're going to do with path, we're going to add the DOS folder, a semicolon, and then the Norton Editor folder as well. So this will mean that we won't have to keep on typing in the path. Okay, so I'll just go on to the new line, and then we'll do Alt F save, Alt F exit. So the MS-DOS 5 edit.com was very, very similar to the Norton Editor there. So if you now just go up to the root folder, we'll just check that things haven't been corrupted here. That's okay. So autoexec.bat appears to be okay. Let's just type it. Yeah, that looks good. So I'm just going to reboot this, and hopefully that should now mean that my keyboard is working okay, and also that we can type in DOS commands without having to include the DOS path in it. Okay. So now I should be able to type commands like do fdisk, for example. Don't have to type in the path to that. And just to check, I'm going to do Shift 2 gives me that. I have the pound symbol, that's a sterling symbol, and the hash symbol come out okay as well. So those are some of the things that quite often cause problems. Now what we want to do is also, I do a directory listing here. Things are coming out in the United States way, so we've got the month, then the day, then the year. In MS-DOS 330, then with the internationalisation, if we set the correct country settings, then in fact we should be able to get the dates coming out in my preferred way, and that is the country.sys, which goes into the config.sys. So we're just going to now create a config.sys file and actually put in the appropriate country settings. We're going to use Norton Editor to create a config.sys. So we're going to create the config.sys. So we want to put in the command country equals 044, which is the code for the UK. And we'll also do break equals on, so this allows us to use the Control-C, Control-Break to break programs, even when they're not waiting for input. We'll also put files equals 10, so we'll probably run into a problem with that sometime soon. So do Alt-F, save, Alt-FX. So if we look at the directory listing there, we have the month first, then the day, then the year. So now if we reboot and see whether or not we've got the changed internationalisation settings. Okay, so it's saying bad or missing country.sys, so we probably need to put the path to country.sys in there somewhere. In fact, the documentation I was reading was incorrect, and in fact you need something more than just this. So what we're going to do edit this. And what we actually need, in addition to the country code, which is like the international dialing code, we need to specify what code page and also where country.sys is. So that's the bit that it was complaining about. So we need to put in the DOS.sys. One of the problems I have had is that the documentation for MS-DOS 330 is quite patchy. There isn't the official Microsoft MS-DOS 330 documentation available, only various manufacturer versions. They all have mistakes in, and some of them don't have the complete information that we need here. So just going to reboot that again. Right, so that's worked now. Let's see if it's actually made a difference. Okay, so now we have the month, September is in the middle there, so that would appear to have worked. It does indicate that in the days of MS-DOS, life was a lot more complicated, and the documentation, should you actually have access to it, wasn't always great because there were various mistakes and things. Even with the web now, there's various sources of information and not all of them are right. Okay, so we've rebooted with the configuration files, and now we can see that the dates are coming out with the day, month, year. Now what I'm going to do is just make two directories, one called temp and one called work. I had a few problems that when I was using work files in the root folder, sometimes the root folder was getting corrupted. So the worst comes to worst, if we work in subfolders and they get corrupted, we can just remove them and recreate them. So it shouldn't require me to reformat the C drive every time that there's a slight problem. So I need to look into this, but for the moment this should be okay. So now I'm going to go into the DOS folder, just test that the keyboard's working okay. So now I do Shift 2, I should get double quotes. Yep, when I press the @ symbol, I get the @ symbol, and the slashes are now coming out correctly as well. So that's good. Now, when we do a directory, there are only two switches that the directory command has on this version of MS-DOS 330. So we can do a wide listing and we can do a paused listing. You'll see that the order that it comes out is not exactly what you would normally expect. So one of the things you can do, we can actually pipe the output from one command to the next. So if we actually do dir pipe to sort, we'll then get an ordered list. And what we can also do, I'm just going to use the F3 key that recalls the previous command. We're then actually going to redirect that, and I'm going to put this into a folder in temp, and we're going to call this dos.text. So hopefully I'll just do a, yep, so that root folder's still okay. I tried this on an earlier version, and when I was doing that it actually corrupted the root folder. So now if we go into temp, what we got there, editor dos.txt. Okay, so this allows us to go through and actually have a look at all the files and things in here. So the first two I think are related to EGA fonts and things. Anti.sys was one of the ones we looked at when we were looking at Zork, in that if we load anti.sys, it means there are escape sequences can then allow you to change the text and bold, highlighting, colours, things like that. Append's an interesting one. Append is a bit like path, but it works for data files. So if something's looking for a particular data file and it doesn't find it, it will then look in the path specified by append. Assign allows you to map other drives, so that, for example, if you had something that needed to run off the B drive and you didn't have a B drive, you could use assign to map, say, the A drive to the B drive. Attrib allows you to set read-only and archive attributes. I don't believe this version will allow you to set things like the system. You might be able to set hidden, but you certainly can't set system with this. Backup is a very basic backup utility. Doesn't do any compression or zipping, so really there's not a lot of point in using it. Checkdisk we use quite a lot. That is checkdisk with /f. That will actually fix any corruptions of the particular hard disk or floppy disk. Command.com is the command interpreter, which is loaded by default. Comp is compare. It's a compare utility. Country.sys we've already used for our configuration to provide the localization settings for the UK in this particular case. Debug is quite a complex program. Apparently this was originally in ROM when the first version of DOS was being created by Tim Patterson. Apparently debug was what he was using as a monitor, and it kind of grew from there. And this allows you to not only disassemble code, set memory, fill memory, it also allows you to assemble code as well. So you can type in assembly language and it will actually convert that into machine code. We've also got some disk compare and disk copy utilities. Those appeared in PC DOS versions before they became in MS-DOS. Display.sys and driver.sys are related to the config.sys file. Particularly display.sys is needed with EGA and VGA graphics cards if you want to be able to change the code page, the font. So Edlin is the original basic editor, so I would recommend not to use that. EGA.cpi is again related to loading fonts. Exe to bin allows you to convert an executable file into a COM file. So the difference between an executable and a COM is the COM must be run inside 64K, one segment, whereas an exe can have multiple segments. Sometimes it's beneficial to convert exe into COM if it's small enough. Fast Open is a utility that, when loaded, will help to speed up the opening of files, particularly on hard disks. FC is another compare utility. fdisk is what we use for partitioning hard disks, and one of the main enhancements in MS-DOS 3.3.0 was that it now allows you to create an extended partition, and you can create multiple extended partitions in that larger extended partition. You are still limited to 32 megabyte partitions, but if you had a larger hard disk, you could at least have sort of a D, E, F, G, H to use the disk space. Find is just a searching files for certain patterns and things. Format we've used for formatting floppy disks and the hard disk. Graph table and graphics are related to being able to do print screen of graphics pages out to printers and things. GW Basic is the Microsoft Basic that comes with these versions of DOSes. Earlier versions of Basic were built into ROM on the original PC, and Microsoft provided this Basic. I think it gets replaced by Quick Basic at some point in time in later DOS versions. We've got a copy of io.sys, which is the main BIOS interface, which is a hidden system file in the root directory when we use the sys command. So join would allow you to make a drive letter appear as a folder on another drive. So for example, you could, if you had a D, E, F, G and H drive, for example, then it would be possible to make those look like folders, perhaps on your C drive. So you could create perhaps a folder on the C drive called drives, and underneath that you could actually then use join to actually map a particular drive into a directory underneath there. So keyboard is the utility we've already used for internationalisation, so we can use different layout keyboards, and the keyboard.sys is the driver needed for that. Label allows us to change the volume label on a hard disk or on a floppy disk. LCD, I think that again is code page information for LCD displays. The link utility is shipped with DOS, although there isn't anything provided with DOS capable of actually creating object files, so you would need a third-party assembler or C compiler or something like that. But the link utility is provided, so if you had the object files you would be able to actually build executables should you want to. The mode is used for configuring various devices, so particularly the video, the printer and serial COM ports. More allows us to pipe output from a particular program to more, and it will paginate it much like you can under Unix or Linux. MSDOS.sys, the main operating system part of MS-DOS that goes as a second file on the boot folder. NSFunc is related to the internationalisation support and allows you to change code pages. Print allows you to print files to a serial printer or a parallel printer. Printer.sys is the driver needed for that. ramdrive.sys was actually new for this release, I believe, or perhaps 3.2 release, and this allowed you to allocate an area of RAM to behave like a hard disk. As more than 1 megabyte became common on PCs, then a RAM drive would allow you to perhaps copy some of your DOS or some application into the RAM drive, so it would actually run faster from RAM than it would off the floppy disk or hard disk. Recover is an interesting utility. If you had a floppy disk, for example, that had bad sectors on it and you had some important data, then Recover would allow you to read the sectors which were readable and would miss out the ones which were unable to be read. So effectively, if you had something with abort, fail, retry in reading a file, then Recover would at least try and recover those sectors which were still readable. Replace is something that's not often used, but I think the main thing this was used for is if you're upgrading your version of DOS, then you might use replace on your new version of DOS to copy the executables over onto the existing DOS. And there are options on there to only update those items where the dates are later on the source than the destination. Restore is the opposite of the backup command. Again, it's a bit limited on what you can do, and in later versions, MS-DOS 6 onwards, then the central point backup and restore, which was much more flexible. Select is not very much use. I did try to use Select. This is a utility which will help to install DOS and do some configuration. It will do some of the internationalisation configuration that we've just been doing earlier in this video. However, I haven't been able to successfully get Select to actually complete. It does get sort of halfway there but then falls over. It was rewritten in MS-DOS 4 and I think it was abandoned altogether and replaced with the MS-DOS 5 setup, so we're not going to spend any time looking at that really. Share was actually part of the file sharing necessary to have network file shares, so if you wanted to use a network operating system to share files, then Share was required to be loaded. Sort we've already done to produce this at listing. We piped the directory listing to sort. Substitute is a bit like the reverse of join. It allows us to take an existing drive and folder and actually make it look like a new drive. So for example, we could make, say, C:/DOS appear as the E drive, for example. Sys is a utility that is used to actually copy the operating system files onto a blank floppy disk or hard drive. With a floppy disk, it's important that the space in the either the floppy disk needs to be empty or that the file sizes for the io.sys and ms-dos.sys need to be the same size, otherwise sys will actually fail. So quite often a format/s is quite often a safer alternative rather than using sys, but sys is sometimes useful perhaps for a hard disk to actually copy or update the operating system files on there. Tree is able to actually give you a hierarchy of all the folders, and there is actually a switch on it as well that allows you to include the file names as well. And then Xcopy is probably the most useful of the utilities that was added, and this has options on it to do subfolders. So if you want to copy a whole directory hierarchy from one drive to another, then X copy source destination /s will copy the whole lot. So those are all the external commands. There are also quite a few internal commands in DOS, but I'm not going to go through those. But each release, there were changes between what was shipped, and what I will be doing is producing kind of a comparison between PC DOS 1, 1.1, 2, 2.1, 3, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3 and MS-DOS 5. When we get to later versions of MS-DOS between 5 and 6, then the changes, there were some changes, but really the most significant changes occurred really up to 3.30. Was pretty much a very solid release. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything that you really needed. And then MS-DOS 5 really probably was the best one to use, particularly if you're trying to use DOS games, and sometimes MS-DOS 6 would use too much memory. So DOS 5 was probably the most useful version for certainly doing games, and will also run Windows quite happily. Okay, so what I've shown is we've gone through and configured DOS manually. So I'm still working on the CGA video controller for the next phase of the Breadboard PC. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, please hit subscribe, and if you found the content interesting or useful, please hit like. It just helps to make the videos available to more people. Thanks for watching.